Hi, welcome to Podcast Land. I'm Victoria Wilson, official introducer. Here's episode 1 in our new saga on the art of the arts. Here is one of our most admired cultural historians. He's written critically acclaimed books on the actor studio and the method, on one of Broadway's most influential directors, producers, Hal Prince, on the tempestuous pathfinding Viennese director OTTO Preminger, and the genius composer Kurt Weill. Foster's book on film noir is considered to be one of the best, if not the best, on the subject, which is actually how I came to meet Foster, but that's another story for another time, for another podcast. It's a good story. And there's no one better to write about Hollywood and the movies of the 50s. So the book is a portrait. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the book, and then we'll start. The book is a portrait of an America flush from its victory after the war. America and Hollywood and the movies of the 50s were in an evolutionary moment. A continental shift was taking place with the studios, the movies, and with the country itself. The country was shell-shocked and stunned by the power and devastation unleashed by the atomic bomb. And it was steeped in a Cold War where the stakes were total. Convention abounded with post-war opulence as the country settled back into peacetime. Now, Foster's book, I just want to say a little bit. It was, as I said, I recently published it at Knopf, and it was acclaimed. It was called The Definitive Book on 1950s Hollywood. It's been called the best work on Hollywood history since Andrew Sarris's You Ain't Heard Nothing Yet. Not one of the great titles, I might say, for Andrew Sarris, not for Foster. The book's been called knowledgeable, astute, remarkable, and there's much more, but you get the picture. So, as I say, it's a fascinating look at Hollywood's most turbulent decade and the demise of the studio system. And, it was a period when the film industry both set convention and broke norms and traditions, from Cinerama, CinemaScope, and VistaVision to the epic film and lavish musical. It was a decade that saw the rise of the anti-hero, the smoldering, the hidden, and the unspoken. Teenagers gone wild in the streets, the sacred and the profane. The revolution of the method, the socially conscious, the implosion of the studios, and the invasion of that ultimate body snatcher, the small screen television. So, Foster, let's talk about the first question really that I asked, and that I think people would want to know, is how did this book come about, and what did it come out of for you?
It came out of, for me, the period of my growing up as a film goer, because the 50s was my decade. That was when I first started going to the movies and developing consciousness about the movies. And so I wanted to write a book about how I fell in love with the movies, how I saw the movies, what I thought of the movies then, and what I think of them now. So it's a sort of, it's the word Janus. I look to the past and I connect between then and now. But the most important inspiration was I wanted to revisit my younger self. And writing the book, I kept running into my younger self.
And what did you think of your younger self when you were seeing that little boy in the movies?
When I was seeing that little boy in the movies, I liked him. I liked his enthusiasm. I was very grateful for his good memory, because I can tell you where I saw the films, who I saw them with, and what I thought of them at the time. An almost total recall of the movie-going experience. And Vicki, some of the best responses I've had from readers has been that reading your book, and you're talking about your personal experience of going to the movies, made me think about my experience of going to the movies. So I thought of when and where I saw movies and with whom. You make going to the movies a personal experience. And it is very much a first-person book. first word in the book is I. I remember where I sat, the first sentence. And that...
I guess it's been said before, as I say many times in many ways, but, and the movies were designed this way, but they I don't know that they are now, that's another conversation, a kind of religious experience in the dark, in that theater with that screen that was the size that it was.
And what we didn't know then is we saw movies in palaces. They're all gone virtually now. You have anonymous screening rooms. Going to the movies now is nothing like going to the movies when I was a kid. I saw Shane at Grauman's Chinese. I saw The Robe at Grauman's Chinese. I saw the first Grauman films at the big, fabulous theaters. The theaters were almost as much a show as the films themselves. Nowadays, the theaters are absolutely anonymous screening rooms. It's a different experience.
Well, weren't the theaters sort of like going to the court of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer or the court
Absolutely.
of Lowe's or RKO or whatever?
Absolutely. My young students look on almost as if they don't quite believe me when I say what it was like to go to what was known in the trade then, a single-screen theater. We had no multiplexes.
Of course.
You went to see that movie at that theater. This way, you go to 15 screens at the supermarket. It's not the same feeling.
Right, you're going down this aisle for this movie and this aisle for that movie.
Yeah.
But so what were some of we're going to talk about, of course, some of the movies, but what were some of the movies that you remember seeing? I mean, you talk about The Robe, but what are some of the other movies that sort of seemed ordinary but had this magical, profound effect on you?
One of my earliest and most unforgettable movie-going experiences was when my mother took some neighborhood kids and me to see All About Eve in 1950. I was too young to see All About Eve in 1950. My neighborhood kid friends were too young. My mother wanted to see the latest Bette Davis movie. So she parked us in the back of the Golden Gate Theater, and she moved up front. She knew we weren't going to like it. And after the film, she said, "How did you kids like it?" We hated it. It was not a movie for 6, 7, 8,
right.
9-year-olds. And she loved it. She loved Bette Davis. I remember that vividly. And then, of course, when I saw the movie as an adult, I realized what a great film it was. And I remember as a kid almost dying of boredom during that long car scene between Bette Davis and Celeste Holm. Excruciatingly dull for a kid. Seeing it later, I realized it's one of the great scenes in movies.
Well, I remember when I went to the movie with my aunt to see The Goddess. And I must have been 8 or 9 years old. There's no way that movie, we were going to see that movie for me. Yeah. She wanted to go to the movies, and I'll take you to see The Goddess.
Yes.
I mean, I remember that. I remember that movie. I remember how scary Kim Stanley was, as the craziness was scary.
But the movie was not for you.
No, the movie was for an adult human being
Yes.
who could take in the emotion that was coming out of the screen.
But scary for a kid.
Yes, but scary for a kid.
I remember going to see Born Yesterday, also much too young to see it. And I was with an older friend. She was 3 years older, and she said to my friend and me, "You guys didn't understand a thing in that movie, did you? You didn't know what was going on, did you?" I had to agree.
As if that was your fault. No, we didn't. So why would you take us to it? But I mean,
but then later I
think
how great Judy Holliday is. How could a kid know what a unique personality Judy Holliday was?
But can you remember some of the movies that you saw at Grauman's that were for you, that made a difference?
Yes. When I saw Shane at Grauman's, I was more or less age appropriate, and I identified with the young actor Brandon DeRoda. And I remember thinking, this is I love movies. I think that was one of the first times I was old enough to really appreciate feeling that I had for movie-going and movie-going experience. That film and me connected.
Well, the storytelling is so simple and sort of pure in that movie.
So pure, and the visuals are so powerful.
Combined with the visuals and even the music.
And the music. It was unforgettable. When I saw the aerobic dramas Chinese, I'll never forget the screen opening up. And it was the first time, after all, we had widescreen films. And it was the impact was extraordinary. I'll never have that kind of a charge of movies again. I grew up, my first real career going to the movies was 1953. Cinerama, CinemaScope, and 3D, all in 1 year, because the studios were nervous. They had to get people back into the theater, so they had to attract new technology. So I grew up.
Well, talk a little bit about what was going on then. That was because in the beginning of the decade, or at the end of the war, how many millions of people a week went to the movies, and by the end of the 50s, how many people were staying home with that little box and watching television?
The biggest movie-going attendance ever was the war years. Those numbers will never be seen again. Then after the war, as people moved to the suburbs and as television entered the living room, the numbers began to drop, and the studios got very scared. And the numbers continue to drop. They arrested total decline and defeat, but they never again and never will again achieve the numbers of the war years. So it was a studio really under a kind of mortal threat. They saved themselves.
Well, it's interesting because the studios in the beginning didn't like radio, and then they learned to use it.
The studios, the old moguls, hated all new technology. They're like me with computers. Everything is a nuisance. I want it to be the old simple way. All of the moguls hated the new technology. They wanted to continue to make black and white films in the old boxy Academy ratio, but they realized they had to adapt and change in order to attract a newer audience. They had to. Reluctant.
So talk. I mean, you mentioned before, what you were after, but talk a little bit about your ambition for the book and how you set out to write it, and what was sort of the guiding notion for you.
My ambition was twofold: was to revisit movies that I remembered having had a big influence on me in the 50s, but it was also a cultural or social impulse. I wanted to correct all the nasty, stereotypical things that people almost reflexively say about a, quote, dumb decade, the 50s. It was my decade. It wasn't a dumb decade. The stereotypes are insulted. If you lived through the 50s, you know that it was a much more complex and challenging and anxious period than the superficial version of it. So I wanted to correct that notion.
Well, it was a sort of decade that was sort of going in two different diametrically opposite directions, in that there was the conventional father of the bride in Oklahoma and Brigadoon.
Yes.
And then there was the rebel without a cause.
Yes.
And it came from outer space.
It was both. Of course, stereotypes always have some basis in truth, don't they? So the stereotypical father knows best, Ozzie and Harriet, 1950s, is based in some cultural truth. But that's just one small fabric of a very complicated age of anxiety. And I wanted to...
And of course, the age of anxiety... Yeah. Go on, sorry.
No, I wanted to give a full, multidimensional description of the period. So it's not just a book about the movies of the 50s, but I'm hoping it's a book about the cultural attitudes and temperature of the 50s. And you said to me early on, and the sentence I remember throughout the writing, don't simply go from film to film. You've got to make connections to the period. You have to anchor the films in the social matrix. And that was
Which you do.
Which I do. That was good advice. One reader wrote to me and said, "You give us a lot of cultural background. I wanted more about the movies themselves." I hope I did both. But it's not just a book about the movies. It's a book about the movies and the culture. Thanks to you.
So,
but that's what I wanted to do anyway.
but don't you think, I mean, let's talk a little bit about this movie. I don't know if people have seen it. If you haven't seen it, I don't know how well it holds up, which is This is Cinerama. But it is sort of the quintessential early decade film.
Absolutely. And 1952, I saw it from the balcony. It was an amazing portrait of America as a new world power. Cinerama is an anagram for American, and the colors for Cinerama were red, white, and blue. Very conservative, very patriotic, very pro-American. America is the best of all, the best of the best, and the best of all possible worlds. Not a point of view that would pass muster today. I showed it in a format, called this Smile Box format to students in a course that I was giving, so I wanted their reactions, and they found it very alienating. It seemed as if it was news from a different planet.
It was from a different planet.
It was from a different planet. But I wanted to recreate the sense of fullness and I mean, the good things about the 50s, the prosperity and the relative comfort. And the film does give you that. You cannot see it in its original format any place in the world. Cinerama no longer exists.
You know, the thing is, before we come back to Cinerama, you know, I think that, again, based on absolutely nothing but instinct, that when we look at the 50s now, it's different than when we looked at the 50s in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. The 50s now, Eisenhower delivered. We sort of laughed at Eisenhower. I mean, I sort of wasn't conscious during the 50s politically, but Eisenhower delivered his promise of peace.
He did.
And, you know, he did come together to create a world that was, even though the CIA was doing whatever it was doing and causing ferment that was going to explode in the next decade, the decade you're now writing about, those 50s, because that was the decade that I grew up in, and they were, I mean, I didn't see them then, but when looking back on them and knowing what one knows, they were a decade where, even though the bomb had just totally shaken the whole universe of the world, it was a time of safety.
It was. And I take the title of the film that you mentioned before, Rebel Without a Cause. That was a title you could not dare and wouldn't give to a 60s film. But in the 50s, you could. That's a significant title. They were rebels. They were emotionally deprived and psychologically unstable. But they didn't have a cause. They were living in a world that didn't have a war, that there weren't wide protests. And that speaks for an element of the safety of the 50s. But do you think we'd look back on the 50s now with a little more generosity?
Absolutely. Not only generosity, I think yearning.
Really? That it was a better...
Yes, I do. I mean, look, there were people who were suffering, people who, you know, were feeling the dreadful effects of racism and hatred in the country, and that has been there, and we hope it won't be there forever, but it's in the genetic makeup of this country, alas, for many reasons. But the fact is that, you know, and when you think of, you know, you see Lena Horne in a movie, or you see, and then you see how they couldn't use the same entrance, couldn't sleep in the same hotels. I mean, racism was there. However, not even however, and also, it was a time when when there was an order. It wasn't, the world had not fractured in the way that it had, even though the bomb had been there. I mean, that's what we feared as we were growing up in the 50s and 60s. What were we afraid of? The bomb. Now, today, children are afraid of the end of the world in terms of the planet that we are living on fracturing from its own.
Whereas you're suggesting that in the 50s we now see there was a social and political stability that we no longer enjoy, despite all the problems.
Well, I mean, when I'm thinking about what we feared the end of the world in the 50s and 60s by the bomb. Now we are fearing the end of the world. Children are fearing the end of the world by our sloppiness, by our indulgences, by our lack of awarenesses in terms of, we are on planet Earth and it has to carry us, and planet Earth is imperiled. Things of that sort. I mean, it seems almost quaint to say we were scared because of the bomb.
Well, but that word makes me nervous because I wanted to take quaintness out of people's views of the 50s. Because I don't think it's a quaint period. It
isn't a quaint period, and those fears were huge then.
They were
the
huge
bomb.
then. And
that was, but what I'm saying is, who would ever say that the bomb is quaint and the fear of the bomb is quaint? But in relation to the fears now, today, that I think children and just adults of all ages are experiencing with the anxiety level of the world, that the 50s, that's why I say they were a safe period, even as it was fracturing in its own way. And
in its own way. And I spend a lot of time in the book on the blacklist and the HUAC investigations of alleged communism in Hollywood and the rampant fear of communism.
The terror.
The terror of a communist takeover. And I remember being in school in the 50s, being a young kid. We were indoctrinated into fear of the communist other. That the communists were godless, they were subversive, they could enter your house, they could control you. The great 50s metaphor is the invasion of the body snatchers. The Reds are coming to get us, and once they take us over, something crucial is missing in our human DNA. Soul is missing, spirit is missing. We all become blank-faced, because that was the popular view of the communists as godless, soulless, familyless, period. A group of people who chose as their god a political belief and not religion. So the fear of the communist takeover was so vivid and real to us kids in the 50s. And I did want to communicate that, and it's reflected in the movies. And I was expecting that I would be called on the carpet for this, but I'm sort of lenient about the anti-communist films. I don't come down on them and decry them for their ideological shortcomings. Some of them are actually very good films, even though we may disagree with them ideologically. A crazy film named My Son John. Do you know that one? With Helen Close. They find out My Son John is a communist. The fear and loathing of the communists and the way they sense that their son being the communist taints the family.
Do you think that,
and I like
when you say it, that the 60s translation of My Son the Communist is My Son the Homosexual?
But he's in that in the 50s too, because that character is gay. He's not only.
Oh, of course. He'd have to be gay and a communist.
Of course, they could call him a Red. They couldn't call him gay in the 50s. Couldn't mention the word, but it's their subject.
No, but it had to be that extreme level of aberrancy.
Absolutely. Nothing else could explain it.
Right. So also, talk a little bit about those. There is the invasion of the body snatchers, but there were so many of them. Killers from outer space and
them, The Incredible Shrinking Man, The Thing, It Came from Outer Space. What I discovered, one of my main discoveries of the book, was that before 1950, American movies had no science fiction. Science fiction as a popular genre was invented in the 1950s with Rocket Ship XM and Destination Moon, both films from 1950.
Wouldn't you say that the William Cameron Menzies Things to Come was a kind of science fiction?
Yes, it was. But that was a British film. That was science fiction.
Okay.
But Hollywood and science fiction got married only in 1950, after the bomb and the fear of the bomb. And then the Metaphors of them is a terrific movie because the ants have been created by atomic blast. They're red, they're also communists, they're a matriarcha, they're also women. Talk about the metaphorically, allegorically loaded 1950s sci-fi extravaganza. Everybody go to see that. It's fabulous.
Well, and let's talk about, because in this mix there are two other elements that we should talk about. I mean, there are many others, but big category are the musicals, the MGM musicals, which was a huge industry unto itself and wonderful.
Wonderful, but I do talk at the end of the book about genres that reached their apex in the 50s, and then they were never to be the same again. Film classic.
Because partially, don't you think, because those talents were not there anymore?
Talents were not there. Certainly for the musicals in MGM. MGM was closing down its musical department. The studio was closing down. There were no more 7-year contracts. They didn't have the personnel to do the musicals. So the 50s was the last period of the great original MGM musicals. It's not that musicals died in the 60s. There were a lot of them. They were adaptations of Broadway hits. In the 50s, the greatest of the musicals were original movie musicals. A movie, I know you're not crazy about, but many feel it's the greatest of all, the musical Singing in the Rain. It's a movie original. American in Paris, a movie original. And one of my favorites, Gigi, though I got a lot of trouble with my students when I showed it this past semester, they said, Professor Hirsch, you've showed us a movie that is about child grooming and pedophilia. I said, that's not the way we thought of it in the 50s. I said, we're reading it from our own perspective now. And I had a student who wrote a brilliant exam saying that Gigi is a work of pedophilia. I disagreed with every word he said. It was brilliantly argued. I gave him a name. How's that for open-mindedness?
Well, I think, there's something about being able to write something and communicate your argument.
Yes.
That even if you disagree with it, you're interested in the argument that's presented.
Absolutely, and it's presented cogently, even though I disagree with it. But the musicals of the 50s were the last hurrah for the original movie music. Then in the 60s, look at all the musicals that won the Oscar. West Side Story, My Fair Lady, Sound of Music, Oliver. Those are old-fashioned musicals,
right,
but all based on Broadway hits, not original.
What was that musical? I can't remember if it's a Yip Harburg musical with Lee Marvin.
Paint Your Wagon.
Yeah, Paint Your Wagon.
Paint Your Wagon. Way over.
That's not.
That's the 60s, but that's based on a Broadway hit. It's not an original.
Okay, and the other film it seems to be a sort of big, sort of central metaphor of the time of the Westerns. And there were so many that were made, and they presented, it was sort of the furtherance, now that I'm thinking about it, it was sort of the furtherance of the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Hitler character, the gunslinger, the bad man, the evil man, and the hero.
Well, the concept of heroism, I think, changes in the Western. You get the anti-hero, and good and evil become much more ambiguous. But also, what was remarkable about the 50s, and again, I'm being defensive about my decade, the revisionists Western. For the first time, American movies took a look at how indigenous characters had been presented and tried in a flawed way, but tried to present Native American characters with more sensitivity. A film like Broken Arrow, for instance, in 1950, is an attempt to correct the reactionary Westerns. John Ford himself wants to rethink his treatment of racial others in a very
well. Wait a minute. You know that movie that he what was it with Natalie Wood?
The Searchers.
Yes, The Searchers. I mean, that's not exactly. It's a brutal movie where they kill Indians, butcher Indians one after another. I'm not so sure that he was rethinking much there.
He was, because the character played by John Wayne is a racist, but he changes as much as he can by the end of the film. Instead of killing the niece that was abducted by the Indians, he takes her home. He can't go in the house with her, but he doesn't kill her. For a character like that, a reactionary character like that, that's some kind of ideological progress. That's a very complicated movie. It's a movie about racism, but I don't feel it is itself a racist movie.
You know, I just want to interrupt. There are a few other questions that I want to ask you, and some actors and directors that I think would be fun to discuss. But I do want to say that for our next podcast, what I thought would be fun is to pick each 2 movies that we want to discuss from the 50s.
Great.
And we can decide what they are. You know, it would be fun to have people watch beforehand so that they can be part of our podcast when we're
talking. They can join in and agree or disagree.
Yeah, but that means we have to come up with what those movies are going to be, and I don't know. I mean, we can think about it. But
for instance, I'm not saying it will be The Searchers, but that's a quintessential 50s text because it brings up a lot of issues, and I think it's been misread. I think it's a film that merits a reviewing. I really do.
Okay, all right. Well, that's a possibility. I mean, you'll pick 2 and I'll pick 2.
Very good. Wonderful idea.
Okay. So, you know, as we were talking about change and, you know, cultural sort of implosions that are going on, and the films, they made those movies. Now, it's true they made them for a young audience that was ripe to watch them and that was hungry to have them because they communicated something that was going on with kids that they connected to, and so they were money makers.
They were money makers, but the 50s figured out that teenagers were a new demographic. That teenagers who came from well-to-do families or families where money wasn't an issue had disposable income. Give them the kind of movie that they wanted to see, or a movie about themselves, they'd go out to see it. So 3 huge box office hits of the 50s were The Wild One, Rebel Without a Cause, and Blackboard Jungle. They had an enormous influence on the exploitation title films like I Was a Teenage Werewolf.
And of course there's the other great movie, which is 1956, which is Giant, where James Dean is on the screen. And of course he'd already become an icon because he'd been killed before the movie came out.
So James Dean, though he was 23 or 24 when he was playing teenagers, and that was a problem with the movies. The actors were too old to play teenagers. I was a teenager when they came out. Now, in my high school, we said, all these kids are too old to play us. I guess that's just a convention of Hollywood casting. But because James Dean didn't live on, he became a perpetual teenager. You know, the first teenager, the original teenager, the forever teenager. And over the years, I like to show his films to students. I have never, ever had one dissenting voice about him. Not one student in any of my classes. This is going over generations now.
Because do you know that over generations...
He hasn't dated.
He hasn't dated. That's exactly right. And the reason why he hasn't dated is because people are still imitating his look.
And his sound. He caught the nerve of the country in an extraordinary way. And he has not dated. Students who don't know names of the old stars that I mentioned, they know 3 names for sure. They know James Dean, they know Elvis Presley, and they know Marilyn Monroe. Those names are universally recognized.
Well, and when you think of James Dean, who stopped at 23 or 24, and then you read, okay, well, Marilyn Monroe would be what, 70 or 80? I mean, you can't put the two things together.
I think she'd be 100 in 2026. That's her centennial.
Okay, so let's move on because I can't take that in. Okay, so you've written the book in terms of large subject rather than chronologically, and talk about how you organized the book and why.
Well, you were a huge help on that. The structure that the book has now was not inevitable. I think it's very much the right structure. I knew I didn't want to do a chronology. It's not a year by year. It's thematic. And I knew the place to start was with the studios because they were in decline. Every studio and every mogul was in decline. There was only one old-timer still standing at the end of the 50s, the indefatigable Jack Warner. Everybody else was gone. They were deposed, they died, they left. He was still there. The studio culture was dying. Every studio.
How did he survive? Why did he survive?
He was shrewd as hell. Stubborn as hell.
Well, the others weren't exactly.
No, they were very shrewd, but they died. Poor Louis B. Mayer was deposed. Darryl Zanuck came back, but he left for romantic midlife crisis reasons.
He left. He was destroyed by his midlife vanity.
Yes, he was. Yes, he came back, but it was never to be the same. Howard Hughes was a madman at OTTO who helped in destroying the studio. Every studio was under mortal attack. It was threatened.
But that sort of happened to Mayer too, because he basically got bored with it, even though he might not have said he did, and became obsessed with horses. It's the same kind of midlife distraction.
It's the distraction, but in Mayer's case, it was financial. The movies that he was producing in the late 40s weren't turning enough of a profit. He had lost his instinct to anticipate popular taste. All the old moguls said, I can predict what the audience is going to like. And often they were right. And certainly Mayer was right. But his taste post-war and a changing culture looked too antediluvian. He was old school. And we had this idea.
Except when you look at them now and you think, thank God he made them.
Thank God he made a movie like Meet Me at St. Louis, which is the quintessential Louis B. Mayer movie. That was his
I mean, at some point we can have a conversation about Vincent Minnelli.
You're not a Minnelli fan?
Not really, no.
I think that's a wonderful movie. It expresses the ideal of Louis B. Mayer's MGM. He said, our business is making beautiful films about beautiful people. And if you don't believe in that, you don't belong here. It began to seem a ridiculously old-fashioned notion. So he was booted out, and MGM turned out more problematic films. Problem films, social drama films.
Social message films.
Message films. You think Glory Sherry destroyed MGM?
I do.
And I have to.
And I will just say this, that his daughter, who I published, and who I was fond of, and who was a total original, just died.
Jill
Robinson, yes. And she was quite a spirit. Anyway, talk a little bit about the pictures that you watched that were the great discoveries for you.
Well, again, I'm surprised that there wasn't more of a reaction. Some of the films that I hadn't seen were the political films. I was a communist for the FBI. You may hate the film Politics. It's very good filmmaking. A rarity named The Red Menace, which is terrific filmmaking. It's it's an anti-communist screed. It's hysterically right-wing, but it believes in itself, and you feel the commitment and the sincerity. A wacky film called Red Planet Mars. I heard from a reader last week said what I liked about the book was I took down titles of films I'd never heard of until I saw them in your book, and I looked at as many of them as I could find, and they were all discoveries. So my discoveries have led to readers' discoveries. I'm not going to say you would like Red Planet Mars or Red Menace, but I would say they're really important films.
Well, that's fun.
Time.
I mean, you might want to put up a list. I mean, look, everybody should buy this book because you're going to have a great time with it, and because it's going to introduce you to a whole new world, or you're going to see movies that you loved and thought about and think about them now in a different way, in a different context. And that, of course, is what books are all about and what it's for. So let's talk a little bit about the directors that shaped the decade. I mean, Vincent Minnelli, Kazan, of course, Hitchcock. I mean, when you think, there are so many movies that Hitchcock made. I mean, the 50s were the sort of apotheosis of his career, I think.
Without a doubt. Hitchcock had his greatest period of creativity in the 50s. Strangers on a Train, Vertigo, Rear Window, The Wrong Man, ending up with Psycho, North by Northwest. Not too shabby.
I mean, it was one a year.
Practically.
Vertigo, right. Okay, and there...
Vicky also made his worst film in the 50s.
Which was?
The Trouble with Harry.
Oh, right.
Terrible. Terrible.
Do we know why he made that movie?
He thought it was funny. It was British humor that didn't translate into...
No, it didn't work.
It didn't work for 1 second.
Okay, so then there's Nick Ray, Billy Wilder, of course. And I would say maybe the 60s were the height for Billy Wilder, but the 50s he was on his way. I mean, Ace in the Hole is a quintessential 50s movie, I think.
Absolutely. What about Sunset Boulevard?
And of course, Sunset Boulevard, which I think, it may be one of the movies I think I may want to discuss because of the way it does and doesn't hold up, and the way in which you look at her today and you think, why does she have to be crazy? I mean, I know she has to be crazy because that's the story, but why did they make her crazy when she was, 50?
She was 49 when she shot the film, Glorious Fox. Yeah.
Anyway, there's, Howard Hawks.
Howard Hawks, William Wyler had a terrific decade in the 50s. Stanley Kubrick came to creative and artistic fruition in the 50s.
Joe Mankiewicz,
Joseph Losey,
Douglas Sirk.
My favorite. Yes, my favorite.
So many at Kazan, as I said. George Stevens
had a great run in the 50s. Yes, it was a period of great. John Ford made some of his most important films in the 50s. And then it began
go ahead.
To change. For each of those major directors, I would say the 60s were less kind. And again, death and attrition. I would say that Hitchcock didn't ever attain the same level after Psycho. And
of course you left out Dial M for Murder.
I did, and I shouldn't have. It's wonderful.
But I mean, it's such a quintessential movie of the moment.
But only
and in 3D, which
you didn't know it was in 3D.
No, I didn't know it was in 3D.
It's great in 3D. It makes a fabulous case for the way 3D can enhance and charge the film image. I love 3D. We haven't talked about that.
No, we have to talk about that.
I love 3D.
And let's do this. Let's stop for now. And what we should do is we'll each pick 2 movies, and you'll have to just tune in to see what they're going to be. And it'll be fun. It'll be great fun to talk about them. And then we can talk a little bit about the actor and actresses of the decade: Montgomery Clift, Rock Hudson, Gene Kelly, James Stewart,
Marlon Brando,
Marlon Brando, your favorite, your throb, Tab Hunter, Wendell Corey, and those are the men, and Monroe, Hepburn, Vera Miles, who most people would not think of as.
She's terrific. She's terrific. Have you seen The Wrong Man, Vera Miles?
Yes.
She's fabulous.
Yeah. But also, one thing that might be fun is to
She's still
compare
with us, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know that. Maybe we should have her on.
Miles she won't talk to anyone. She's still with us. She lives in.
Okay. That's another thing that we're going to be doing. We're going to be having. Foster's interviewed a lot of people, a lot of actors and actresses, and we're going to have a lot of people coming on who we're going to be in conversation with. And, coming up, we're going to be discussing movies, I think, and then, Foster, you can talk about your list with David Lean's Great Expectations, Sam Wood's King's Row, Shane, Hitchcock's The 39 Steps. One could do a whole series on Hitchcock, but The 39 Steps, Foreign Correspondent, Michael Curtiz's Flamingo Road, which I think is an insane movie, but interesting, Black Narcissus, Howard Hawks' I Was a Male War Bride, Capra's Lost Horizon. It goes on and on and on. The Ten Commandments. As I said, Ace in the Hole, Sabrina.
You mentioned Ten Commandments, because I wouldn't want to end our first podcast without saying I'm probably one of the few people alive who has a real soft spot for the ancient world film epic. I love them. Ben-Hur, one of my favorite movies. I don't care what anybody says. I love those movies.
Well, we can talk about that in our next podcast. And, also another quintessential 50s movie, Nick Ray's In a Lonely Place.
Absolutely.
But then to me, this is like the essence of 1950, of the 1950s. It has everything in it, and that is Picnic.
Yes.
It has the longing, the sadness, the yearning, the despair, the questioning. It's got it all in one movie.
And actually, when I turned in my first draft, you said, "Where's Picnic?" And you made me go back, or you suggested I go back and write an extended passage about it. And you were right, because it's a quintessential film. Absolutely.
Yeah. And
1950s cinema.
And then, of course, there, Streetcar Named Desire.
Tennessee Williams, all of the Tennessee Williams plays.
On the Waterfront. Anyway, so there's lots. We're going to have a great time talking about this. But you know what? This podcast is really about on the art of the arts. So we're going to have people on who, have written biographies that are just being published, or written collections of essays or novels or whatever that somehow touch on movies, music, ballet, whatever we want. It's going to be great and open-ended. And at some point, I do want to talk about Reflections in a Golden Eye, because my theories about that novella, which I don't see as a novel, but I do see as a novella. So look, I hope we've had a great time. I hope people will come back. I hope you'll come back and visit with us, because there's lots to come in our podcast on the art of the arts. And we will see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you, Foster.
Thanks.
Dare any raindrop to pop in my eye on a wonderful day like today, on a wonderful morning like this, when the sun is as big as a yellow balloon, even the